Welcome to Spartan Media. We're proud members of the National Ethnic Press and Media Council of Canada. Being members of that wonderful organization gives us the opportunity to bring the latest news from our community and beyond. This segment is dedicated to the next federal election. As you know, Prime Minister Harper has indicated that we're going to have an election this October 2015. All the leaders have taken the opportunity to approach the public and different organizations and media sources so they can put out their way of doing things, their planning, and their agenda. Last week in our meeting at City Hall, the leader of the opposition paid us a visit, Mr. Tom McClare, and expressed his views and his agenda for his party for the next federal election. We hope you enjoy this video, and we hope we're going to help you make some serious choices for your future as members of our wonderful country, Canada. We're going to have to apologize for some technical difficulties that we experienced making this video, and we're hoping that it won't happen in the next one. Again, we apologize and enjoy the video.
What we're seeing right now is increasing inequality in our society. Mr. Harper, with 15%. We don't think that that's a recipe for the country that we've always known as being a fair Canada. We want to make sure that we bring up the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, show leadership, and the provinces and territories will follow suit on that. So we've got a plan to help small businesses by giving them a tax break, giving them an incentive to invest, and that's the type of thing we're going to be talking about tonight. As I go around, I prefer to say what I have said, rather than risk forgetting something. How are you?
It is an honor for the organization and for all of you that we have with us the leader of the official opposition of the federal government, Mr. Thomas McClare. And also we have a number of members of his caucus, which I thank you all three for coming with us tonight. So thank you very much, Mr. McClare, you are the boss.
Start off by introducing my friends and colleagues who are also here with me today. Rathika Sitsabayasan, who's the Member of Parliament for Scarborough Rouge River, is here with us. And I noticed that she very cleverly surrounded herself with many members of the Sri Lanka media, so it shows that she's doing her work in the writing.
And the Polish.
And the Polish.
Just on my left is Andrew Cash. Andrew is the Member of Parliament for Davenport, here right downtown in Toronto. And of course, many of you also know Matt Calway, who's just a little bit over in Beaches, East York. Another tremendous colleague who's been doing an amazing job for us on issues involving municipalities. So, welcome to each and every one of you. It's always such a reminder for me whenever I have a meeting here in Toronto and I get to meet members of specialized media like yours, how diverse the country is and how much that diversity is reflected here in Toronto. A couple of years ago, we were doing, during the summer, in the summer of 13, we were doing a tour and we held a meeting on some of the changes that Mr. Harper brought into the tax code that were especially punishing some of the cultural communities, whether it was special spices from Southeast Asia, the saffrons and the others that went into different dishes, or saris. And as people pointed out, these were taxes directly, these weren't tariffs. This wasn't about imports and exports and protecting Canadian manufacturers. These were things that weren't made in Canada. and they were taxes directly on one community, several $100 million worth of taxes. And when I walked into the room, it was such an eye-opener, because even though it was an issue specific to several countries in particular, I had 30 media there to cover that specific issue, and I always retain that as a reminder of the fact that Toronto is indeed the most diverse major city in the Western world. There's no city as diverse that has 50% of the population that was born in other countries, and that represent, as I went around the room, it's just an incredible tapestry. And it's an honor for my colleagues and I to be here with you today. We're going to concentrate tonight on one specific area, but I just wanted to tell the chairman in response to his question and his remarks about potential for photos after. We'll stay as long as it takes to give you as many individual photos and talks as you like. My staff in communications describe my scrums as talk till they drop. So I'll be here with you, able to answer all your questions for as long as you would like. That's indeed my pleasure. We're going to be talking about creating jobs in particular tonight. You see, one of the things that we notice with the Conservatives is that they talk a good game with regard to jobs, and they even put up some job numbers that on the face of it can appear quite appealing, but you have to scratch away at the surface of those job numbers to realize one thing that many of you have probably already noticed. Across the Greater Toronto Area, more than 50% of families can no longer rely on a single, full-time, permanent job. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that there's 50% unemployment. But what I am saying is this, that in most families, mom and dad are crisscrossing each other. They're going out to more than one job. Because most of the jobs that the Conservatives boast about are actually part-time jobs, precarious jobs, low-paid jobs in the service sector. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in just the past 3 weeks, with the closure of stores like Mex and Jacob and Sony and of course Target, there's tens of thousands of service sector jobs that have also been eliminated in our country. So you see, the combined effect of wrong choices is starting to have an effect on people's lives. Because Mr. Harper made a big bet at the beginning of his work as Prime Minister. He bet all of his chips on one thing, that the resource sector would continue to boom. Well, we all know that resources have always been boom and bust. So you have to have a balanced economy. You have to have a strong service sector. Of course you've got to have a strong sector like extraction and mining, but you've also got to have a service sector, and you have to have a manufacturing sector. Under Mr. Harper's watch, 400,000 well-paid manufacturing jobs in Canada have been killed off. So we have a plan. And that plan concentrates on a few very specific ideas. One is to help small and medium-sized businesses. And you might say, well, why don't you help the big businesses? They must be the job creators. Did you know that in Canada, 80% of new jobs are created by small and medium-sized businesses? So Mr. Harper's always favored the big bags and the oil companies, these huge businesses he's given $50 billion in tax breaks to. Mr. Trudeau would do the same thing. We're saying, hold on, go help the businesses that create the jobs. That's the way to start creating the next generation of well-paid job in this country. So we would drop their tax rate by, in proportion terms, it turns out to be close to 20%, by going from 11 down to 10 and then down to 9%. So that is a big difference. We were with a small business person today who said for him it would allow him to right away to start hiring new people. That's a big change for us. It's a really good change. We'd also make an incentive to invest faster. What's called a capital cost allowance is how fast you're allowed to deduct an investment if you buy a new computer system or you buy some other new equipment in your own business, a printing press or something. You have a certain number of years to make that deduction against your income. We would accelerate that, especially if it was an income, if it was an investment in manufacturing, and if it was money that you were spending to create more jobs in Canada. You'd be able to accelerate your capital cost allowance. And that would be continued because it is in place right now, but it ends in just a few weeks. So we'd make sure that that continues. And the other thing that we would do, of course, is we would have an innovation tax credit, make it more interesting to use all the engineering and technical talent that we have to start coming up with processes that would help here. The purpose of all of that, of course, is to create good middle-class jobs, because we understand that your businesses will only thrive if the advertisers come in and buy advertising space, and the advertisers will only come in and buy advertising space if they've got people coming into their store, into their supermarket, into their business, their insurance company or whatever, buying their services. And that's why it's important to keep money flowing and keep the economy going. So we've got a couple of other sound ideas to make sure that that money gets into people's pockets and gets spent. Right now in Canada, there's no federal minimum wage. It was removed 20 years ago by the Liberal Party, and we're just supposed to follow the provincial minimum wage. But did you know that here in Toronto, if you have a family of 2 kids and mom and dad are both working full-time at minimum wage, that family actually lives in poverty? Because by the time they're 35 hours a week at $10 and something an hour, there's maybe going to be $300 a week left. By the time they've paid rent and everything else, they have to be working full-time to be able to afford anything. But it's not a good way to be. So we would bring in a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. We'd also put in place, and this is the last point I'll make before turning it over to your questions, we'd also put in place a system of regulated, quality, affordable childcare. Here in Toronto, many families are paying over $2,000 per month per child. That's the cost of a house. You know, it's like a second mortgage. And because Mr. Harper has closed the door to family reunification, I'm sure that you have friends and family and people in the community who talk to you about this all the time. It's very hard to do family reunification today because it's the best social program is a united family. But since many of the grandparents can't come in, you need to rely on other forms of care because both parents are working. So it's this vicious circle that's made life more and more difficult for the middle class, for the average working family here in Toronto. And that's why the NDP has a series of solutions that I've just laid out. So Mr. Chairman, if that's okay with you, I'll turn it over.
Peter Gagliacos from the Greek TV.
The top of connection. Anyway, we all agree from what you said that the majority of the people don't feel they have the fair share of the Canadian pie. Middle class, lower class, as you said. Bottom line is, how do you get Harper out for the middle class? The key question here is that it keeps coming back from the last election. In the States, you have 2 parties, either one or the other. Here, you divide the vote. If you want to get Harper out, now we have the Liberals in the lead. If you divide the vote, and a lot of people in the last election, maybe they were right or wrong, they said a vote for an NDP is a vote for Harper because you're dividing the vote. How do you avoid that? What do you have to offer more than the Liberals from the people's perspective? My second question is, a big fear is interest rates after the election. A lot of people are mortgaged up to here. An interest rate will see a disaster in the market. A lot of people lose their homes. Give us your perspective, if you can, on those 2 issues, please.
What big issues, Peter. Thank you very much. I completely agree with you. The best way to avoid splitting the vote is never to vote Liberal. I think that that's the absolute #1 solution.
Jim might not agree with you.
But here's the deal, and it's important to look at the facts. Whether it is socially, so for example, we have a plan for affordable, quality childcare across the country. We're going to invest heavily in that. We have that plan. The Liberals are against it, but so are the Conservatives. So they have the same views socially. Whether it's economically, Mr. Harper has given $50 billion in tax reductions to the richest corporations. Mr. Trudeau agrees with him on that. Whether it's environmentally, the Keystone XL pipeline represents the export of 40,000 Canadian jobs, raw product being exported to the United States instead of taking care of Canada's energy security and creating the jobs here. Mr. Harper and Mr. Trudeau agree with Keystone XL, the NDP is against it. So whether it's socially, economically, environmentally, we have very different approaches. I loved your reference to the American system because there are those in the Liberal Party who try to make that point. They try to say, well, let's be like the Americans, let's just have 2 parties. So it's like saying you have a choice between Coke and Pepsi, but you're not really changing anything. This time around, Canadians want change because we've been through a very dark, long winter with Mr. Harper. And they want spring, they want hope, they want change, but they want positive change for them and their families. And we're the only ones talking about removing inequality in our society, canceling Mr. Harper's income splitting plan, coming up with a $15 an hour federal minimum wage so that people who work at the minimum wage will be able to have a living wage, and that becomes a model for the provinces and territories, because the federal government only controls the wage for about 1 million Canadians. But it's a model, it's leadership, it's showing what has to be done to kickstart the economy. We have a 3-point plan before Parliament right now to help business create jobs. Accelerated capital cost allowance, innovation manufacturing tax credit, and of course reducing substantially the tax rate of small and medium businesses, of which it should be borne in mind, create 80% of the jobs. That's a plan to create middle-class jobs. We're on that. That's who we are. We're actually going to do it. And I'll talk to you, Peter, because I bet you were around for the Red Book of Mr. Chrétien in 1993. Remember when he wanted to get back into power, he had a Red Book. Well, the Red Book said a couple of things that were right at the top. We're going to get rid of the GST. That was in their first Red Book, it was in their second Red Book, it was in their third Red Book, it was in their fourth Red Book. They never got rid of the GST. They promised that they were going to create childcare spaces in Canada. That was in their first Red Book, it was in their second Red Book, it was in their third Red Book. Instead of buying all these red books, buy one orange book. We will actually get things.
Janusz.
On interest rates,
Oh, on interest rates, I mean, the market is essentially going to be the deciding factor there. They're not going to stay this low. They're at historic lows and they're staying there, but it's a sign of a very weak economy. The fact that the Canadian, the Bank of Canada recently lowered them again is a sign of weakness in the economy, and we've seen the Canadian dollar dropping. But that weakness is ascribed primarily to the fact that the Conservatives, despite all the talk about themselves, are not good managers.
So I studied international development and history at university, and I've sort of noticed a disturbing trend in our government, closely, very, very closely allying and mirroring the United States political actions abroad. They're, you know, we were talking about terrorism and rights, security, having our rights taken away, spying, these things. I noticed Stephen Harper's very, you know, friendly with the Americans when it comes to these topics. And I, growing up in Canada my entire life, appreciate the distinction that we have as a unique society from America. I once heard Romeo Dallaire speak, who was a general that went to Rwanda during the genocide. And he said that Canada is a middle-income nation and needs to stand independently as a middle power, and instead of just going with the bigger powers, it needs to push forward its own, you know, unique identity, its own agenda on these issues. So I just wonder, you know, generally, how the NDP sort of views their relations with the United States, whether, you know, they are sort of more for a more...
Thanks for that important question, Melissa. I would think that the best way to summarize my philosophy, I hope it's not overreaching to use that word, is that we have to have an independent foreign policy. Which means, logically, that more often than not, our interests will jive and correspond and be in sync with our American neighbors and allies, because they are allies and they are friends and we have a lot of shared history. But when it's not in our interest, we have to be able to say no. I think that a good example of that was when we said no to participation in the Iraq War in 2003. There was tremendous pressure at the time, and it took a lot of courage to say, no, we're not going to get involved in that war. And I think that it took a lot of courage, and a lot of people stood up and took notice this fall when we were saying the same thing. And we'll see how it works out, because you can be sure that Mr. Harper is going to have another pro-war agenda coming up in about 6 or 8 weeks in the House of Commons and try to stir up the pot around that. We're consistent. We understand Canada's point of view, and that's the only point of view that we're going to defend. We are part of certain international groups, whether it's the United Nations, which is of course the most important one, or it's NATO, which is our most important group that we're part of for defense. We're also part of NORAD. These are all things that we've done in the history of our country. But I think that every self-respecting country has to develop its own foreign policy and have its own point of view. Otherwise, you lose a lot of your sovereignty. And, you know, we used to talk about, use a word like Finlandization at the time of the Soviet Union to explain the fact that Finland didn't really have the autonomy that it needed vis-a-vis its Soviet neighbor. Obviously, you know, going back to the old expression that living beside the United States is a little...
Think about retirement.
Well, I would add to peace of mind, I would add dignity. because people have to be able to retire with dignity, because the people who built this country and give us everything that we've got, and many of them, hundreds of thousands of them, are living in deep poverty. You know, there are a few things that become reference points for you when you're trying to make it a better society. I don't accept as inevitable that 800,000 Canadian children go to school hungry. Matter of fact, in a country as rich as ours, I find it a scandal. I don't accept that there are third world conditions on First Nations reserves across the country. I find that a scandal and a shame, and something that we should wake up every day and feel badly about, because we're not doing anything about it. Here, with regard to pensions, I mean, think about it. We're one of the few countries in the OECD that does nothing to protect pensions in case of bankruptcy or insolvency. We will change that. You know, when you watch big companies like Nortel fold and go under, and people, my neighbor across the street, she retired 20 years ago from Nortel. Last year she lost 1/3 of her pension, 35% gone out the window, just disappeared from the books. It's not there anymore. How's that possible? It's actually become a strategy of lawyers buying companies to figure out the tricks of getting their hands into the pot of the retirement money, and getting that, that's workers' money. That's foregone salary that was theirs. And I think that's the scandal here, is that we have to make sure that we protect them. So some of the things that we will do, we've been working with the Canadian Labour Congress to make it a priority to double the CPP, the Canada Pension Plan. Start with something that already works and work on that. And that's a good way of making sure that people will retire with enough money to live on. And I'll add one point. I said to you before that, as far as I was concerned, one of the main jobs of a social democrat is to remove inequality in our society. I dare say that in our society today, the biggest inequality is between generations. Because if you think that we've got it rough, realize that the next generation coming up, kids are borrowing $60,000 to get their degrees in university, and they're paying $2,000 a month for childcare. How are they supposed to get ahead? This is the first time in Canadian history that the next generation and the next generation actually have less than the current generation. So the debt is sometimes ecological. We're leaving them a mess that they're going to have to clean up. Sometimes it's economic. But sometimes it's social. Because as all those people come to retirement without enough to live on, who's going to pick up the tab? We're going to ask the next generation to take care of us. So it's another obligation that we have to get it right now. That's why it's good for me to be surrounded by so many young MPs, because they're always there reminding me that we have that obligation. And Matt,
say a few words. Just a couple comments in my capacity, both as consumer affairs and also multiculturalism critic. So on the airport issue, and I think that's an important one for everyone, because we do live in, especially here in Toronto, a global city. People are coming and going all the time. You're visiting relatives, you're doing business. We've been told for the longest time that because oil prices were high, the tax on airplane fuel had to go up. And now that we see that the prices have gone down, we haven't seen the prices of our tickets go down. So that's something that we've made a point of bringing that up and focusing and trying to focus the government's attention on this. People are having a hard time making ends meet, and yet we see the airlines who had their prices elevated because they said, well, we have to add cost for the fuel, but they haven't reduced their prices. So there is a very, very concrete way in which folks could get a break. Is for the government to actually take a look at this seriously. I also wanted to just talk quickly about payday lenders, and I think for people right across the GTA, we see that it's harder and harder for low-income people to get access to banks, banking services. The big branches are no longer in those neighborhoods, and this is the flip side of the issue you raised about the government sort of turning turning a blind eye to this hoarding of billions of dollars in offshore accounts. And on the other hand, turning a blind eye to the way that payday lenders do their business. This is a loophole that companies have found so that $100 loan at a payday lending shop you can be paying 600% interest annually on that loan. We've called on the government to tighten those loopholes as well. So it's not just on the big corporate big corporate businesses that are hiding monies. We're also trying to tighten the loopholes for everyday, regular working folks who can't find a bank to bank in. So that's another important one. And then lastly, on family reunification, the question was how many is enough? Well, we have to understand, first of all, that the Harper government has fundamentally shifted the whole concept of immigration away from permanence and building community to temporary. You want your parents to come? Get a super visa. It's a temporary 10-year visa. It's costly, but that's their solution. And then, of course, they put a moratorium on family reunification, and then lifted the moratorium just a little bit, and then closed it again in the last 2 years, as you know. So our position, and what Tom's articulated often in the House of Commons, is that we have to put families back in the central place of our immigration system, that families are the core of who we are. And if we can't reflect that in our immigration system, then we have a serious problem. And I'd argue that we do have a serious problem. This is something that we are committed to fixing. And as Tom just said, many of the ways in which the Harper government has damaged our country, we can fix. And this one around immigration is really key. And then finally, around pensions for this, essentially the question was around pensions for the freelance, self-employed sector, right? Because all of you are self-employed. All of you are freelance, and you represent millions of Canadians who are doing who are freelance, self-employed, on contract, working multiple part-time jobs without an access to a pension or benefits or job security. We're taking a very serious look at all of these things. I mean, as some of you may know, I was a self-employed freelance person for 25 years before politics.
One thing about Tom's leadership of the NDP is that he's brought forward transformative democratic reform in the form of proportional representation. He's brought it forward in a way that, although it's been NDP policy for a long time, it has never been emphasized in the way it has been under Tom's leadership. And 2015, we want it to be the last unfair election that's fought under the current system that produces incredibly false majorities. The Conservatives had 39.5% of the vote in the last election and achieved 54% of the seats. It's not just the Conservatives. That's how our system has worked for 150 years. One of the best things about the proportional representation system, called mixed member proportional, Germany has it, New Zealand has it, Scotland has it, that we've put forward, is that it's a proven way to create a more collegial, effective politics. It's not just about everybody's vote counting. It means that Parliament starts to work in a way that it is not as adversarial and not as ideological as it currently is. And the other benefit, I think, that should be of great interest to the folks in the room is that all social science studies show that when you introduce a proportional representation system, the diversity of representation in your legislature goes up. And although the NDP has very specific proactive policies to ensure that our candidates represent Canada in a way that, frankly, the other parties do not have structured processes for, all the parties will start to benefit from a proportional representation system so that the face of the legislature will begin to more reflect the face of Canada as a whole. And so stay tuned. This hopefully will be one of the major points of difference between us and the two other parties that are completely status quo, who believe in a winner-take-all electoral system like that we have right now.
Mm. Before closing for the pictures, let me express our wish to you. For the last 2 years, my members did not receive even a penny from the federal advertisement. And I know that last year they spent $120 million. This year they spent almost, 14, they spent $105 million. But not even a penny any member of ours received from them. And they continue the same way. This is February, and I don't think did any one of you receive any advertisement from the federal government? I don't think that anybody received anything. And this is a year of elections, of course. And I will appreciate, sir, if you bring that to the floor of the House, because this is unacceptable totally. An industry, all these people are trying to survive, and the government is putting millions of dollars to TV and mainstream TV, because, as a matter of fact, Rogers closed down on the ethnic channels, and we don't get that. Thank you very much for your time, for being here.
I just wanted to give a little certificate to the NEPMCC. Just to remind us about this wonderful evening that we've had together.
Thank you.
And for my friend Athanasios,
Thank you.
I've got a lovely little gift, because it's Chinese New Year, of course, Lunar New Year. A lot of the communities are celebrating that. So a little gift from us in the NDP.
Maria, come here close, please.
Can I suggest that we just take some photos of the
Oh,
Sure.
all right.
Come over this
Let's
way.
go there.
Thanks, Maria.
Yeah, I guess so. My pleasure.
Here we go. Perfect.
Move it wherever you want to.
From this side.
Sorry.
More close.
What do you want me to do?
She's married. She's married. Come and check on one more person. Okay, now. Now, start shooting.
Don't shoot the messenger.
We have to have a wide angle. Two stars.
She's ours. She's ours. We'll back into the pond in a second.
I have your hand, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
This way for us.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, wow. That worked well.
Jenna, take a picture of them. Jenna, take a picture of them.
Over here, guys.
Can you please look this way?
So follow George? All right.
Hello, come on.